Hi everyone. Okay. Hi everyone. Okay. Am I live? I don't know. I'm here in Maine at my mother's house, and I'm outside to try and get a little bit of something like privacy. And it is fairly cold, but I'm in the sun. Hopefully things will be all right. And hopefully the internet is strong enough out here that I'm not constantly breaking up all the time. All right, so today we are discussing, or I'm going to be talking about, Sigmund Freud and the first two chapters of a late work by Freud, Civilization and its Discontents. So, Sigmund Freud, whose dates are 1856 to 1939, is in our Fathers series, often referred to as the father of psychoanalysis. And I think in this video it'd be useful to give a little overview of psychoanalysis and Freud's thought in general. So Freud is not, strictly speaking, a philosopher, although he's certainly thinking about many of the same questions and themes that philosophy typically takes up. He is a psychologist. He, was a doctor, got a medical degree, and was one of a sort of leading group of doctors and psychologists in the later half of the 19th century who were interested in treating the mind as part of the body, interested in mental disorders and attempts to treat mental disorders. The most prominent mental disorder of the 19th century was hysteria. And Freud was one of several psychologists to sort of experiment with different ways of treating and trying to cure hysteria and other forms of neuroses. Hysteria to Freud was a form of neurosis, a sort of mental disorder. All mental disorders, what we today call mental illness, was in the 19th and early 20th century called neurosis, right? And the most common of these neuroses was hysteria, which was commonly diagnosed in women, right? That's where the stereotype of the hysterical woman comes from. And there were a number of questionable medical responses or medical procedures, cures for hysteria. Anyway, maybe it's not important to get into the checkered past of psychoanalysis, the early days of psychoanalysis, but it's probably enough to understand that psychology, psychiatry, as it was beginning to be determined and formed in the second half of the 19th century, was right on the sort of border between science and pseudoscience. And a lot of these psychologists were engaged in sort of sketchy behaviors of all different kinds, including, widespread experimentation with cocaine, etc. If you're interested in knowing more about that, there's a lot of really interesting stuff to learn about the early days of psychology and psychoanalysis. But Freud is the figure who really sort of brings psychology beyond the border between pseudoscience and sort of normal science and method of psychological treatment, which is psychoanalysis. Right? So in psychoanalysis, Freud called it the talking cure. Right? Psychoanalysis is the treatment of neuroses, of mental illness through talk therapy, right? And in order to understand how this talk therapy works, we have to understand the basic concepts of psychoanalysis, Freud's conception of how the human mind works. So Freud's sort of major insight or contribution is the discovery, as they say, of the unconscious, of the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind was something that was of interest to a number of 19th century psychologists. The interest in the unconscious was, and here you can sort of see its roots in various kinds of pseudoscience, the interest in the unconscious mind developed out of things that other things that psychology was interested in. For example, hypnosis and mesmerization. Right, Mesmer was a famous hypnotist who also had sort of provided a lot of case studies for psychology. And so, what happens in hypnosis is that you can see in the hypnotized patient or the subject of hypnosis that right, in hypnosis you are unconscious in the sense that you are not conscious of what you're doing or saying. If you've ever seen a hypnotist, I don't really know what I make of hypnotism, honestly, but I have seen a hypnotist before, and it's pretty wild. The person who's hypnotized appears to be conscious, right? They are able to receive commands and carry out commands. So if the hypnotist tells them to bark like a dog, they'll do so, right? Which we would say certainly seems like conscious behavior. But at the same time, they aren't conscious of it, right? So what appears to be conscious is, in fact, unconscious behavior. When the hypnotized person is, woken from their hypnosis, they have no memory of anything that they've done. So it's this strange intersection of what appears to be consciousness and, experientially is unconscious, meaning the hypnotized person has no experience of what they're doing while they're hypnotized, and yet, while hypnotized, they behave as though they do. So, all that to say, right, hypnosis is this very bizarre phenomenon where the brain is able to operate without the sort of sovereign faculty. That is to say, that the brain is able to take orders, carry them out, is able to function completely without that executive function, which would be the conscious mind. I am conscious of what I'm being told. I'm conscious of my surroundings, and I make a decision as a response to those surroundings. Right, that is the conscious executive faculty of the mind. And so, in hypnosis, you recognize that a lot of brain functioning can be carried out without that sort of executive control. Now, where Freud takes this observation is to a much sort of grander place. And he's going to sort of pursue these ideas into an analysis of dreams. So, we have an interesting sort of callback to Descartes, the importance of dreams and thinking about, our consciousness. Dreams have a lot to tell us about our consciousness and reality. So Freud, develops these sort of interests that are born out of a study of hypnosis, carries them into a study of dreams. And the question that he's asking, in essence, in sort of his most important, well, maybe not its most important, but his first major work, The Interpretation of Dreams. The question he's asking is, what is the psychic content of dreams? What is the meaning of dreams? Can we learn anything about our dreams, or are dreams just sort of random synapses firing, meaningless information, the brain working without purpose during sleep, which was one sort of theory of what dream life is and continues to be a theory of dream life. But in his interpretation of dreams, in his analysis of the relation between the conscious mind and the dream life of the subject of psychoanalysis, Freud observes that very often there is content in dreams that is far more than arbitrary. It is not arbitrary. That our dreams are communicating things that it is important for our conscious mind to be aware of, but our conscious mind is not aware of. And so just as hypnosis shows this strange cleavage between a functioning unconscious mind and the conscious mind, right, which is to say that the unconscious mind is able to function without the conscious mind, we see that same dynamic in dreams, right? In a dream, I have no executive function. I'm asleep. I am definitionally not conscious. So whatever is happening in a dream is not happening as a result of anything intentional that my conscious mind is doing. And so just as in hypnosis, we see a different sort of level of the brain at work, Freud thinks that is also what's at work in dreams, that our dreams are this sort of coded attempt on the part of our unconscious mind to communicate something to our conscious mind. And so this leads to a kind of theory of the relation between our conscious mind and our unconscious mind. Now, Freud is in fact going to have three different levels of consciousness, right? So the most important two are consciousness and unconsciousness, the conscious mind and unconscious mind. But he wants to distinguish the unconscious mind from what he calls the pre-conscious mind. And the pre-conscious mind is everything that we do sort of automatically, or which we have ready to our conscious mind, but which we are not presently conscious of. So the pre-conscious is, my ability to, for example, pick up this bottle of ginger beer without looking at it or thinking about it. Or the example that Freud gives, sort of more tellingly, the preconscious mind is the collection of ideas and memories that I'm able to access, that my conscious mind is able to access easily. So I am not currently conscious of what I did 2 days ago, but if I sit back and think about it, I can bring to consciousness a memory of what I did 2 days ago. Now, the fact that I don't have to constantly keep the memory of what I did 2 days ago in my conscious mind, I don't have to constantly be thinking about it in order to remember it, means already that there is some layer of our mind which stores information outside of our consciousness, uh, and makes that information available to consciousness whenever it needs. Right. So my preconscious mind keeps all of my memories, and included in those memories would be things like right, motor function and sort of the basic proprioception of my body's relation to the world. But what's important about this preconscious mind is that everything that it contains is accessible to the conscious mind. It can be brought back up, right? It is the sort of storehouse of consciousness. But Freud thinks the preconscious is something, there's something deeper than the preconscious. And this is what he calls the unconscious proper. So, what is it that the mind contains that is not only not conscious, meaning not something that we are currently aware of, but also not something that we're able to bring to consciousness? And so, in the interpretation of dreams, Freud will say, we see evidence of this deeper unconscious mind in the dream world, where we see memories surfacing that are not only not part of the sort of conscious life of the subject, but which also aren't available to the conscious life of the subject. So in dreams, we might experience something or get some clue as to an experience in our lives, which, to use the language of psychoanalysis, our conscious mind has repressed. And ultimately, what the unconscious will be made of, what unconscious consists of, are repressed ideas, ideas that our consciousness has banished from ever entering it again. Not just pushed to the preconscious where it can be accessed, but banished to the unconscious where it is repressed. And repression means that it can no longer be made conscious, can no longer become conscious. So we hear about repression pretty frequently in society, right? That you, and this is straight out of Freud, will repress above all traumatic childhood memories. And often, right, so the theory goes, and this is demonstrated in psychoanalysis, there's some empirical evidence for this or sort of clinical evidence for this. Often those repressed memories will lead to a kind of mental disorder or mental illness or neurosis. So these, these repressed childhood traumas, one way that they are able to continue to be effective is through our dreams. Right? We become disturbed. We continue to be disturbed by repressed traumatic memories through dreams. Right? So if you have recurring nightmares, one way to think about those or to deal with those is to attempt to discover what the repressed memory is that's causing those nightmares, and to attempt to bring that repressed memory out of the unconscious, make it conscious, and process it using the conscious mind. That is sort of the essence of the psychoanalytic technique. Freud's sort of theory, but also the process of psychoanalysis works this way: that through talk therapy, through an analysis of dreams, and through an analysis of unconscious behavior, the psychoanalyst can help the analysand, the person undergoing psychoanalysis, to recall these repressed memories, these memories that have been repressed. And the theory is that by bringing them to consciousness, they can then be more healthily processed. That repression is an unhealthy way of dealing with these traumatic experiences, these traumatic memories, and that neuroses, mental illness, can be treated, if not cured, by recovering these repressed memories and processing them in a more healthy way. And this is, still sort of the foundational theory of a lot of therapy, a lot of psychology. But what's really what's more, and I think what is sort of the center controversial, but also such a major figure, is the idea that not only do these repressed unconscious memories affect us through dreams or hypnosis, but that they also affect the way we behave in our conscious lives. That a great deal of our behavior, a great deal of our lives are determined not by conscious, intentional planning or desires, but are caused by unconscious drives that we are not conscious of, not aware of. In other words, that our lives are dictated to a large extent by our unconscious life, not by our conscious life. So I think that it's we're maybe most familiar with this idea, perhaps not accidentally, certainly not accidentally. We're most familiar with this idea through advertising, through the idea of advertising. Right? How does advertising work? There's an interesting documentary about the connection between psychoanalysis and Freud and public relations and advertising. A documentary called "Century of the Self" that I recommend you check out if you're interested in this sort of thing. But in advertising, there's this shift that occurs in the 1920s. Prior to the 1920s, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to recall the name. It was, I believe, Freud's nephew who introduces the principles of psychoanalysis to the PR world. But his name is evading me at the moment, so I'll just continue. Right, in advertising, prior to the 1920s, it was assumed that consumers were rational, right? That people bought things based on practical, rational concerns. That what motivated people to buy things was a conscious intention. And so advertising before the 1920s was sort of, uh, by our standards of today, sort of confoundingly straightforward. It would tell you uh, what set the product apart from other products. It would make a rational argument and try to persuade you using, right, practical ideas that you needed this product, whatever they were selling, right? So it appealed to you as a rational agent, right? You're trying to do X, Y, Z. We have a product that can help you achieve that goal, right? You live your life as a conscious, intentional agent, and we're providing the tools for you to administer your world. In the 1920s, this, see if I can look this up, advertising takes a shift. When this PR consultant named Edward Bernays, thank you, Google, this PR consultant named Edward Bernays introduces the ideas of psychoanalysis into advertising. And suddenly advertising becomes not an appeal to you as a rational consumer or rational agent. Instead, advertising begins to appeal to your unconscious mind. And the most famous example of this was a campaign for Virginia Slims, the cigarettes, that sold Virginia Slims not based on their flavor or their price or the health benefits that some people said cigarettes contained at that time. Instead, Virginia Slims were advertised to women with an emotional appeal, right? An appeal to an unconscious desire that has sort of no rational content. And the advertisements were designed to make the viewer believe that Virginia Slims were a symbol of liberation, right? And this is coming in the wake of the women's suffrage movement, and in general, sort of a period of major moment in the women's liberation movement in the 1920s. And so Virginia Slims, which obviously have nothing whatsoever to do with women's liberation, right? Not in any sort of strict rational way, sell themselves as a symbol of liberation and freedom. And so by making this emotional appeal, by appealing to something that doesn't really have anything to do with the product itself, but makes an association between that product and something that consumers unconsciously or maybe consciously want, but now will suddenly unconsciously connect to Virginia Slims, they're able to appeal not to the rational consumer, but to the unconscious desires of this rational consumer. The most obvious example of this is why do you need a woman in a bikini to sell a car? Right? What does the woman in the bikini have to do with the fuel efficiency or carrying capacity of a car? Things that you might take into account when evaluating a car. The scantily clad woman up there next to the rotating BMW is there, so your unconscious mind connects the car to sexual desire, right? And unconsciously then associates the car with satisfaction of sexual desire. So I buy that car, that then becomes a sort of avatar for my sexual desire. Right? Buying the car becomes a substitute for satisfying my sexual desire. With Freud, it really is always about sex. And so this is sort of a microcosm of this example of advertising, kind of microcosm of the broader theory of the unconscious, which is that our lives are directed by unconscious desires more than conscious desires. So another sort of famous example, and I think illustrative example, useful example, is the idea of a Freudian slip, right, which is a very common sort of point of access to Freud. And the idea of a Freudian slip is, right, that your conscious mind intends to say one thing, but you have a verbal slip that reveals what your unconscious mind is really thinking about, right? And so this is a moment where the unconscious breaks into the conscious world and reveals itself, reveals something about what's really motivating there. So I experienced a kind of textbook example of a Freudian slip in a 6th grade biology class when a girl was talking about, was asking a question of the teacher and meant to say organism, but instead said orgasm. Right? Now, that is a truly textbook Freudian slip because the word that comes out is a word that is directly related to sexual desire and sexual satisfaction. And so the idea there would be whatever it is that you're talking about, and in the context of civilization as discontents, I think it's especially interesting that this is in the context of a science class, right? That in pursuing knowledge, in pursuing education, pursuing sciences even, those conscious desires, those conscious activities are themselves driven by something unconscious. They are a replacement for, substitute for something unconscious, something that is more primordial, more essential, which is almost in every case sexual desire and the pursuit of sexual satisfaction. So when you say orgasm instead of organism, your unconscious mind is breaking through to reveal what is really sort of at the heart of what you're doing, right? The unconscious motivations behind your conscious activity. Amazingly, it's warm enough to take the sweater off. Excuse me. So how does this happen? Right? This is discussed a little ways into civilization and its discontents. How is it that so much gets repressed, and then that that which is repressed is able to direct our conscious lives without our being aware of it? Right? How can it be the case that we aren't aware of what really drives us? And so to understand that, I think it's important to go through just a little bit of Freud's theory of early childhood development, because these repressed traumatic memories that shape our whole lives begin at an extremely young age. And so I just want to explain the theory of substitution, the theory of sublimation, and the idea of cathexis in Freud. Uh, so for Freud, the individual's psyche begins forming at birth. But the psyche at birth is not at all the psyche of an adult. Uh, so let me begin by laying out the sort of basic structure of the adult psyche as Freud sees it. And we'll see how that develops out of early childhood. For Freud, there are three sort of levels to the human psyche. We have, first and foremost, the ego, right? And pretty much everything that we hear about the ego is in the context of Freud's conception of the ego. The ego is our conscious mind. The ego is our conscious life, right? Everything that I do that I'm conscious of is part of my ego. But the ego is influenced by two different unconscious forces or drives. Well, there are many drives, but two different drives, unconscious drives from two different directions, let's say. The ego is set beside what Freud calls the id. And the id is our sort of primordial existence of our psyche. The id is our unregulated, unrestrained desire. Those things that fundamentally drive us. And for Freud, the primary drive of the id is, as we hear in Civilization and its Discontents, what he calls the pleasure principle. Pleasure principle is our prime directive, right? Our primary drive, the drive to pleasure. What the psyche wants most is to attain pleasure, as much pleasure as possible, and to avoid pain. Right? That is the foundation of our psychology, the pleasure principle, the desire for pleasure. So that is the essence of the id. Now, because the primary object of the pleasure principle is sexual pleasure, right? A lot of the id is about the pursuit of sexual pleasure, right? And for Freud, there's a scientific basis for this, right? Which is that, of course, our psyches are driven to sexual pleasure because in the pursuit of sexual pleasure, we find not just the prerogative of the individual psyche, but also of the species and of nature more generally, which is procreation. Right? So to be driven to sexual pleasure is to be driven to reproduction, procreation, the continuation of the species. So this is the sort of form of psyche, and that remains with us our whole lives in the id. Right? The id is that basic drive, essentially. That, however, as we'll see in just a minute, gets repressed by the ego. There's a third term in Freud's constitution of the psyche, and that is the superego. So we have sort of in the basement the id, the ground floor is the ego, and the attic is the superego. The superego is also an unconscious force derived from the id, Freud thinks, but pushing us in the opposite direction. If the id is telling us to pursue sexual satisfaction at all costs, the superego is imposing a strict discipline on us. Superego is, Freud will say, the internalization of the father. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's taking longer than I expected to get through Freud introduction. Should have known. But the superego is the drive to altruism, the drive to be good, right? To be ethical, to be disciplined toward hard work, toward right being controlled. So if the id is this kind of out of control desire for gratification, for pleasure, the superego is the regulating principle that is going to deny the id, right? Is going to drive us instead toward more noble or higher goals. And so these are both unconscious forces, the id and the superego, right? We aren't fully in control, conscious control of our conscience, right? The superego that punishes us when we do wrong, right? That upbraids us when we don't meet our own standards. That's not, Freud doesn't think, a conscious operation. It is the result of also forms of repression and is an unconscious force. So the ego, then, our conscious mind, is this constant negotiation of our id, our sort of primal desires, this superego that punishes us whenever we give in to those desires. It is a negotiation of these conflicting forces of the unconscious. The ego is not only a negotiation of the conflicting forces of the unconscious, the ego is also a negotiation between the drives of the id and superego and the external world. So the ego is this nexus of all of these drives and forces, all of the sort of agents that affect our lives, right? My unconscious drives, but also the reality of the external world. Okay, so let's just talk a little about how this dynamic between id, ego, and superego develops. For Freud, the baby is born as kind of raw id, right? As nothing but desire and desire for pleasure. And what the baby desires, above all, uh, the first object of its desire is, Freud thinks, the mother's breast, right? And the baby wants the mother's breast for a number of reasons, right? But it is the source of all pleasure, right? It provides food, it provides warmth, and it is, right, a comfort. So whenever the baby is nursing, the baby is happy. And the first obstacle that the baby faces, the first time the external world interferes with the psyche of the baby, is in the moment where the mother's breast is not available to the baby, right? Where it wants something that it can't have. And in this moment where the baby realizes that it can't have what it wants, it begins to differentiate itself from the external world. And so Freud tells this whole story about how this happens. And in early infancy, the baby has complete control over the mother, or right, a great amount of control over the mother. In this way, that when the baby wants to nurse, when it wants the object of its desire, all it has to do is scream, and it will get it, right? And so, although the breast is part of the external world, the baby knows that it doesn't have it at all times. The first thing it learns is this mechanism for getting what it wants, right? Forgetting its mother, crying. But this strategy of crying doesn't work forever. The baby eventually has to be weaned from its mother's breast, weaned from nursing in general. And at this point, the baby confronts a new obstacle, which is that it no longer works to simply scream, that its mechanism for getting what it wants has ceased to function. Right? Now it screams, and the mother comes in and gives it a bottle. Right? And this is not at all what the baby wants. And so there is this intense frustration, disappointment, and this new confrontation with reality that I can't have what I want just because I want it. Right? And so this is when the ego begins to form out of the id. When the baby realizes that it can't have what it wants, it has to find a new way of finding pleasure for itself, of self-soothing, we might say now, of satisfying its desires. I can't count on my mother to do it. I have to find my own way of satisfying desires. And the baby first does this by uh, by substitution, uh, by substituting the mother's breast for some uh, other object. Right now, Freud is using this term object in a sort of technical sense, right? So, an object of desire, desideratum, right? The object of desire. Uh, so, this new imperative to take the satisfaction of my desire into my own hands is accomplished through substitution, which is the process of substituting my mother's breast for some other object. And so, right, very often this is a pacifier, right, or a blankie, or some other thing that belongs to the baby, belongs to the child. The child can call their own, and which they are able to get a sort of weaker version of the same comfort they found in their mother, right, from which they can find similar comfort. Now, this substitution of the mother's breast for some other object is a process of transferring my desire for the mother onto some other object. And this is a sort of trick of the mind. It is an unconscious process, right? That what eventually happens is I repress this memory of losing my true object of desire, and I replace that object with something that I tell myself is what I always wanted. The kind of it's not a delusion. Freud wouldn't say it's a delusion. It is simply a psychological tactic. Right? It's a necessary tactic for survival, just that I transfer my desire from one thing to another. But that doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the fact unconsciously that I don't have what I truly desire. Right? So I am directed to find, I direct myself to find satisfaction in some substitute object. And I'm able to get some satisfaction from that substitute object, enough to sort of sate my desire. Right? But I still know at an unconscious level that I'm being denied the thing that I most want, right? That I've played this kind of trick on myself, substituting one thing for another. But in this substitution, we find a phenomenon that Freud calls caffexis, right? Which is the concentration of that unrequited, unsatisfied desire in some other object. Right? What causes this concentration of energy, concentration of desire in this substitute object is sort of mysterious, but where I find, where I place that cathexis will be a major part of how I determine my ego and personality. And so my object choice, my choice of a substitute, is going to be sort of constitutional to my identity. So if I choose, and this process of substitution is not a one-time thing. This process of substitution is a lifelong endeavor. Right? I'm constantly substituting one thing for another. So Maybe first it's my pacifier, then it's my blanket, but then maybe it's something that has a little bit more content, right? It is uh, playing soccer or studying dinosaurs or right, my or drawing, right? It is some activity that I have invested this energy in, that I'm able to get satisfaction out of. And whatever it is that where I locate that energy is going to then be sort of one of the foundations of my ego, of my conscious self, right? How I understand myself. Uh, so that's the sort of basis of ego formation and the separation of the ego and the id. Right now, uh, we can see. I don't want to get into this too much, but for Freud, the desire for the mother's breast uh, is, for Freud, a sexual desire. It's a sexual desire because it's a desire for pleasure and satisfaction. And ultimately, all such desires have their basis in sexuality. Uh, but it also has um, a distinct sexual character to it. It is, right, engages with your orality, right? There's a kind of sexual pleasure that we receive through our mouths, uh, so that, even eating, but certainly nursing, has some sexual undertone to it. Uh, and this is where, for example, um, the neurosis of an oral fixation would come from. So if you are, uh, if you're a 1930s, banker and you're constantly sucking on a large cigar or stogie, uh, that cigar is a substitute for, your mother's breast or something else, right? That desire is carried over into the cigar. And from the cigar, you uh, receive some kind of sexual satisfaction, Freud thinks. Now, the ego is built by the series of object choices that serve as substitutes for the thing that I am not allowed to have, that the world has denied me. But this separation of myself from the thing that I want, my mother, is not random as far as the psyche is concerned. For Freud, the separation of myself from the object that I desire is caused by my father. My mother can't give all of her attention to me, the child, Freud thinks, because she has to give attention to my father also. And I see as a child that when my mother is not paying attention to me, she's with my father. And so my father comes to stand for that which uh, separates me from what I want. Uh, my father comes to represent the principle that denies me what I want. Father comes to represent, moreover, discipline. It is because of the Father that I have to locate satisfaction in some object other than my mother. And Freud thinks this father figure becomes internalized and becomes a unconscious force in my psyche. I internalize the principle of my father, and wherever I discipline myself, deny myself what I desire, it is this unconscious father principle or superego that is at work within me. So this is for Freud a necessary part of ego development. It is what encourages us / forces us to live without things that we desire, makes us capable of living without the things that we desire, of putting off desire, of substituting one desired thing for another. But it can also become overbearing and destructive, right? That in an unhealthy superego, we can become too hard on ourselves. In any case, right, this is the basic construction of the psyche: id, ego, superego. And it all goes back to this relation between myself, my mother, my father in early childhood. All right. So I'm going to take a little break, and then we'll get into civilization and its discontents.